Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Men's Sunday School class at Mercy Baptist Church. Pardon me. We're going to be in Genesis, chapters 41 through 45. This is going to be one of those lessons that the book has for us where they're kind of a victim of they're trying to finish up Genesis by the end of the month. And so they're kind of fast forwarding through this section of Joseph's life. And it's basically going to cover, I think, at least a decade, probably 12 or 13 years of Joseph's life. But before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your grace, your mercy, your love. Thank you for saving our soul, Father, and through the shed blood of Jesus Christ on the cross, Lord, for our sins. So, Lord, as we study these passages here in Genesis, I pray that you would minister to our hearts, Father. Teach us, Lord, more about you and how much you love us, Father, how you deal with each one of us, Father, through your sovereign care, and just help us to be encouraged, Father, by who you are and how much you love us. For it's all in Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. All right, so like I said, this covers a decade at least or over a decade of Joseph's life. When we last left Joseph last week, he had been falsely accused of rape, had been locked into jail, but of course the Lord was with him, had raised him up to be I guess you could call him the steward of the prison. Said whatever was done in the prison, he was the doer of it. And so that's where we left Joseph. Now we picking up. He's still in jail. As we pick up here, we're starting Genesis 41, verse 14. But there's some things that's happened since then. This lesson we're going to like I said, we're fast forwarding through a decade of Joseph's life. We're going to see where God has Pharaoh raise Joseph up from being in prison, makes him the second most powerful man in Egypt, and we're going to go right up to the point where Joseph is confronting his brothers, and he finally reveals, after putting his brothers through a big dramatic series of events here, probably designed just to see what kind of men that they are now. And he finally reveals himself as his brother to them. But to cover, I guess, get us back up to speed, we left him in prison in chapter 39. Genesis chapter 40, Joseph's still in prison. He's been given these duties that afford him much freedom. Then Pharaoh becomes angry with his butler, which is his cupbearer, and his baker, and he has them both tossed into prison, and it happens to be the prison. Well, I say happen. God is the one that's bringing all this together. They're tossed into the prison where Joseph's confined. Each of these two prisoners have dreams, and they're troubled by their dreams because they don't understand what they mean. So then Joseph has them tell him their dreams. He gives the interpretation. In 3 days, the butler is going to be restored to his position. But in those same 3 days, the baker is going to be executed. Now these dreams do come true, and Joseph asks the butler. He says, "Look, when you stand before Pharaoh, he asks him to speak in his behalf." He's hoping that if he gets Pharaoh's ear, that he can plead his case, that he's wrongfully accused, that he shouldn't even be in Egypt because he was sold into slavery, and he's hoping, no doubt, that he can be released and be able to go back home to his father. But God, in his sovereignty, causes the butler to forget about Joseph. And so he doesn't speak to Pharaoh about Joseph. And that's very important in God's sovereign plan, as we'll see here. So 2 years have passed. Now we come to chapter 41. First 13 verses describe how that Pharaoh has 2 dreams in one night, and nobody's able to interpret it for him. He tries to get his magicians and his wise men who are supposed to be able to interpret such things, to interpret it for him, and they can't. They have no idea what the dreams mean. Then the butler suddenly remembers how that Joseph, when he was, how 2 years prior to that, he'd been in prison. Joseph interpreted his dream and the dream of the baker, and of course God's the one that jogged his memory, because God is bringing all this past. If God had let the butler speak to Pharaoh 2 years prior, Joseph might have went home and none of this would have happened. None of the when the famine occurred, Egypt would have been ill prepared, and it would just not have worked out the way God had planned. But God had planned this so that for this particular moment, so that Joseph could be right where he needed to be. And so God jogs the butler's memory. And so then he tells Pharaoh about what had happened 2 years ago with him and the butler having the dreams, each having the dream, Joseph interpreting it, and how it all came true. So we come to verse 14 of Genesis 41. It says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and of course everybody's like, oh, we got to get Joseph in. The Pharaoh, the king, he wants to see Joseph, so everybody snaps to it, and they try to make sure Pharaoh gets what he wants. So they hastily bring him out of the dungeon, and then he makes himself presentable, because he's about to meet the king or over the entire nation of Egypt. So he shaves, because Egyptians did not let their beards grow out the way the Hebrews. Hebrews have got the big, I guess the Duck Dynasty type beard. If the Egyptians had beards, they were the little, almost goatee looking type of thing. So he shaves himself, to make himself presentable to the way Pharaoh's going to expect him. And he changed his raiment, so he puts on clean clothes, and probably instead of wearing prison garments, I guess you might say, in modern terminology, he took off the orange jumpsuit and put on a suit or some nice clothes, because he was about to go see Pharaoh. And so he comes into Pharaoh. Verse 15, it says, And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And so Pharaoh tells Joseph, I've dreamed a dream. There's none that can interpret it. Now, he had his magicians and his wise men who are supposed to be skilled in doing these things in the supernatural, that idea, but they were at a loss. They had no clue what the dream meant. And of course, God, I think, limited them, made sure that they didn't even have any ideas, even prevented them from making up something, which I suppose from time to time they may do. And then another thing, it says, the Lord had prepared Pharaoh's heart to listen to a poor Hebrew slave. He was a slave from a foreign land, He'd been in prison for years, but God had touched Pharaoh's heart to be able to want to listen, to give heed to what Joseph had to say. Then it says, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. We know the butler had told Pharaoh about this. He said, this man named Joseph, he knows how to interpret dreams. And so he says, look, Pharaoh says, I've heard say of thee. I've heard about you, and I've heard that you have this ability to interpret dreams. See, God is bringing this all together. And so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. See, Joseph understood that whatever ability he had to interpret dreams it wasn't because he was so smart or intelligent or some insight that he had. It was because God gave him that ability. And so he says, he humbly gives the credit to God. He says, look, it's not in me. But he says, God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. That word peace there, it can mean peace, but it can also mean welfare or prosperity. It's basically saying, hey, everything's okay. Because in that day, the general belief was if you had a dream, they often meant something, that they were a revelation or a message from the spirit world. And so it troubled Pharaoh that he had this dream and he didn't know what it meant. And so when Joseph says, God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace or of welfare or of prosperity, he's basically saying, Pharaoh, I know you've been troubled by this dream and not knowing what it is. He says, but God is able to give you that answer that will give you peace and assure you of that basically that everything's going to be okay. That the welfare and the prosperity of Egypt will be intact. And of course, Joseph doesn't know he hasn't heard the dream yet. He doesn't have any idea what the interpretation is going to be. But I guess if Joseph had been there to give him bad news, that could have endangered his own life. And because the Pharaoh could have not liked the news and had him executed. But apparently Joseph was trusting God, that God was in this and that this was a good thing. So our lesson skips down to verse 28, and then from verse 17 through 27, Pharaoh describes the two dreams that he had the night before. He dreamed one dream, he woke up briefly, and then he fell back asleep and he dreamed a second dream. In the first dream, he saw the seven healthy and seven malnourished cattle. And the malnourished cattle consumed the healthy cattle. In the second dream, it was very similar. He saw 7 healthy-looking ears, and then he saw the 7 malnourished ears. And the malnourished ears ate the 7 good ears. And in both cases, both dreams, after the malnourished versions ate the healthy versions, the malnourished versions were still just as malnourished. You couldn't tell if they had eaten anything. And so Pharaoh had told, he emphasized that none of his magicians were able to interpret these dreams. So then Joseph, he starts to interpret it. He says, look, the two dreams are one, meaning they're one in meaning. They both have the same meaning. And that God is using these dreams, to reveal to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And then he mentions that the healthy cattle and the healthy ears represent 7 good years. And the malnourished cattle and the malnourished ears represent the 7 years of famine that are coming. So we come to verse 28. And Joseph says, this is the thing that I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. So Joseph says again, Well, he says, this is the thing that I've spoken. In other words, I've already said this, Pharaoh, that what God is about to do, he's showing to Pharaoh. So he's wanting to emphasize the prophetic nature of these two dreams, that this is something that God is planning to do. He's bringing the famine. Sometimes we think, oh, well, God doesn't bring bad things along. Well, in the case of this famine, he is bringing it along. This is not like damage control of, oh, well, the famine just happened to be coming along, and now God's giving this message so that Egypt can prepare for it. No, Joseph says, what God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. He's revealing to Pharaoh what he's about to do. He's bringing the famine. And I've thought about this, and this might be a bit of a rabbit trail, but I think because God is the one that created the famine, he's setting the events in place to bring Jacob and his family down into Egypt, for them to spend some 400 and I want to say 30 years or something, and then come out when Moses, he sends Moses down in there to bring them out, to take them to the land of Canaan. Now, why would God bring Israel into Egypt for 400 years? I think next week we'll see God speaks to Jacob and says, don't be afraid to go down into Egypt, for there I will make of you a great nation. I think he used Egypt as an incubator to transform Israel from being just a clan, a family clan, to being an actual nation of thousands, or I guess millions of people by then. But this is what God is doing. He said he's bringing the famine, but God, he didn't just bring the famine and letting everybody just do the best they can. He said, God is showing Pharaoh what he is about to do. So then verse 29 says, and behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. So now Joseph's putting these dreams, the meaning of these dreams, in context. There's going to be 7 years of abundance when the fields of Egypt are going to bring forth more than what they usually do. But then when the famine comes, it's going to be so intense that it would be like the 7 years of abundance never happened. It'll be like a distant memory, and it's going to be a very grievous or very intense, very terrible time. So then we skip down to verse, I guess about 38. Verses 32 through 32 to 37, Joseph emphasizes the certainty of the coming of the famine because God gave Pharaoh 2 dreams with the same meaning all in one night. Then he goes to recommend that Pharaoh appoint a wise and capable man to oversee the collection and the storage of 20% of the grain that's produced during the 7 years of abundance, in order to do this and to prepare for the 7 years of famine. And then Pharaoh and his servants, they recognize the wisdom in Joseph's recommendation. So verse 38 says, and Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? So it says, so Pharaoh said to his servants, and these servants they're not just, like the janitor or the guy sweeping or whatever. These are probably government officials. It might be his wise men, his magicians, but his advisors, those that attend to the Pharaoh. So he says to them, he says, can we find such a one as this? He is so impressed with Joseph and the wisdom of his recommendations that he just comes to the conclusion. He says, I don't think we can go anywhere else to find anybody that is like Joseph, has the wisdom and the intelligence and capabilities of Joseph. And of course, God is touching his heart for him, because God wants him to favor Joseph to be able to do what he does here in the next verses when he promotes Joseph. But notice how he describes Joseph. He says, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is?" Now, Egyptians were idolatrous. They believed in these multiple gods, and they knew nothing about the Holy Spirit. So whether Joseph or whether Pharaoh knew what he was talking about here, like in our King James Bible, it's capital S, Spirit, because our interpretation is, of course, it is the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit. But Pharaoh didn't know anything about that. All he knew was this God that Joseph was referring to. He said, "Hey, this God, His Spirit must be. He is with you." In fact, the word "spirit" there, the Hebrew word means breath or wind. Kind of the idea that if you're breathing, it means you have a spirit within you. You're alive. But here, he appears to be saying, the Spirit of God. He understands God is with you, Joseph, and He is breathing through you, or that is, He's speaking through you. That what comes from you comes, like what you breathe out, comes from God. So he says, "Look, I don't think we can go anywhere else and find anybody better prepared or better able to do what you suggested than you, because you have the Spirit of God. God is with you, and He is guiding you, and what you say comes from Him." So verse 39, "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, For as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according to thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou." So these verses and the ones following show they're an amazing demonstration of the sovereignty of God, because Pharaoh is ready to just turn everything over to Joseph. Because notice what he says. He says, "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this," he says, "Look, the evidence that you're the right man, Joseph, is because God has already showed you all this. And because of that," he says, "there is none so discreet and wise as thou art." The word discreet there means intelligent or having understanding. And so he says, "Look, there's nobody as smart as you, Joseph, and wise as you, because God is with you, because God showed you everything that you needed to know." So he says, "Look, I'd rather not go to like these magicians. They couldn't interpret this dream. I don't think there's any other man in Egypt that can do what you are able to do, Joseph, because you have the Spirit of God within you, and God has showed you all this." And then notice what he does. He says, "Thou shalt be over my house." Remember, Joseph is a foreign slave. He's a Hebrew slave that's not an Egyptian. He's been in prison. He's basically a nobody, a slave who was arrested, that was thrown in jail from another country. And yet Pharaoh says, "Look, thou shalt be over my house. You are going to be my steward. You're going to be in control of my whole household, running my business." And it's just amazing to me that everybody that meets Joseph, they want to give him the ability to run everything. Potiphar raised him up to let him be the steward over his house. He gets into prison, the keeper of the prison, turns everything over to Joseph to be, to run the prison. And now Pharaoh is saying, "I want you to be over my house." And then he says, "And according to thy word shall all my people be ruled." He's saying, I want you, put you in a position of authority over all my people, over all of Egypt. But then he puts the only limitation, he says, only in the throne will I be greater than thou. The only limitation to Joseph's power and authority is going to be that Pharaoh is still the king. He's the last. He's not stepping aside on the throne and saying, Joseph, I want you to be Pharaoh or be king. He's still the king, but Joseph is going to manage the day-to-day administration of the nation, because when people come to him here, in a little over 7 years, they're hungry and they say, "Give us bread." In Genesis 41, later in this chapter, verse 55, it says, "And when all the land of Egypt was famished, and the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith unto you, do." So he's saying, look, you come to me for bread. He says, don't look at me, go to Joseph. So he's handing all this off to Joseph and letting Joseph call the shots, let Joseph decide how things are done. Then verses 41 through 57. This is amazing. Pharaoh gives Joseph his signet ring, which gives him the authority to, that was the ring that they sealed official documents with. It basically, if you had the king's ring, whatever you could do whatever you wanted to do because you had the king's authority through that ring. Then he honors Joseph with gifts of clothing, of jewelry. He gives him a chariot and rides him around the countryside, honoring him, saying, I'll bow the knee to Joseph. And he gives him an upper-class wife who is the daughter of a priest, because priests were at the upper end, of the social ladder. He just gives him an abundance of honors and everything. It's just amazing that Pharaoh gives this Hebrew slave who's been a prisoner all this stuff. And then Joseph immediately goes into the business of preparing for 7 years of famine. He implements his plan to store 20% of the grain that's been produced by the fields of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. And it says he was able to store enough grain by the time the famine started that not only could he feed the Egyptians, but there was enough that he could sell to other people from other countries. So now we come to Genesis chapter 42, verse 6. But first 5 verses, the scene switches back to Canaan, where Jacob and his sons, Jacob and his family, the famine's affecting them as well. And so Jacob sends his sons to go buy grain in Egypt, but he keeps Benjamin, which is Joseph's full brother, keeps him at home because he's afraid something's going to happen. Hey, last time I sent out Joseph, he never came back. I'm keeping Benjamin home because he's afraid something might happen to him too. So Genesis 42, verse 6, it says, "And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth." Joseph was the governor. By this time, Joseph's his authority. He's exercising his full authority. He's the governor over the land. And it says, "And he it was that sold all the people." So it was under his authority that the grain was being sold. And then here comes Joseph's brethren, and they came and they bowed themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And lo and behold, here they are. They are fulfilling that dream that Joseph had back when he was 17 years old. The 2 dreams. When he dreamed that his brothers were going to be bowing down before him, and here they are. They're doing it. And they're fulfilling that dream that they hated so much. All right, now we really go into fast forward mode here from verse 7 all the way through chapter 45, verse 2, Joseph pretends not to know them, and he accuses his brothers of being spies. Then he eventually sends them home with grain, but he keeps their brother Simeon in prison until they come back with their youngest brother Benjamin, because supposedly that's going to prove that they are not spies. When they return with Benjamin, Joseph treats them to a banquet. Then he sends them home with more grain. Remember, I'm having to fast forward through all this because you go back and read it. There's a lot of stuff going on. But Joseph had his personal cup placed in. He sent them home with the grain, but he has his personal cup, this golden cup, put in Benjamin's sack of grain. Then he sends his men after the brothers to accuse them of stealing it. And when they discover the sack is in Benjamin, or that the cup is in Benjamin's sack, it makes him look guilty, and so they all have to come back to Joseph's house in Egypt. And then Joseph declares that, look, the one who stole my cup, he has to stay here and pay for his crimes. But the rest of you brothers, you can go home. You're free to leave and go home. But they refuse. And they give this heartfelt plea for mercy. And look, we can't go back home. It'll just kill our father if we go back home without Benjamin. And finally, it's such an emotional turmoil here that Joseph can't hold out any longer. He already had little instances where he had to slide off into the next room and cry and clean himself up before he could come back in. Here he says, "That's it. I can't hold out any longer." So Genesis 45 verse 3, it says, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom he sold into Egypt." So he reveals himself. He says, look, I am Joseph. And he immediately asks about the welfare, of his father. Now the brothers, they're like taken aback. They're like, oh my goodness, if this is Joseph, we're in deep trouble. In fact, they weren't sure how to take this. Here's this man that they thought was an Egyptian. He'd always spoken Egyptian to them. He'd always talked to them through an interpreter. And now all of a sudden he says, look, ta-da, I'm Joseph. And so they're understandably anxious. They just don't know how to take this. And then Joseph said unto his brethren, he says, Come near me, I pray you. So he said, come closer. He says, I can prove to you that I'm Joseph. So he has them come closer so they can get a good look at him and see, oh yeah, this is Joseph. I had 20 years and this has got to be Joseph. And then he tells them something that only Joseph would know. He says, I am Joseph your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. So, they were like, well, this has got to be Joseph. But then he says in verse 5, he says, Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. So he knew that guilt had been eaten away at him earlier in this process. Every time things looked bad for him, he would accuse them of being spies and such. They would say in Hebrew, because they didn't think he could understand it, he says, oh, this is God's getting us back for what he's punishing us for what we did to our brother. But and so I think, and of course Joseph understood what they were saying, even though they didn't think he could, because they thought he was an Egyptian, didn't speak Hebrew. But he's telling them now, he says, don't be grieved, don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. He says, don't feel guilty over what you've done. And why? I mean, Joseph is in a position he could easily, because he's the governor of the land, he has the authority that he could have them put to death if he wanted to. But is he taking revenge on his brothers? No. Because he's learned some things over the past 20 years, ever since from the time that he got sold into slavery, every step of the way, he's come to realize God has been guiding my steps. When things look good, he was guiding them, and even when things look bad, he was guiding me. And he's realized that God did this to get me to where I am now. Because he says, don't be grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. So he realizes, he's learned now that, he wasn't the victim of his brothers. God had guided everything, all the steps to get him there, so that he would have the ability and the power and the authority to preserve life. That he collected all this grain, and now not only is he preserving the lives of the Egyptians, he's preserving the lives of his family and of countless, thousands of millions of people in the surrounding countries. He's able to provide food for them. Later, in verse 8 of this chapter, the first part of that verse, he says, "So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God." He's realizing, this isn't just circumstances or happenstance that I ended up being here in Egypt and God just decided to make lemonade out of lemons. This was all God's plan. Later on, after Jacob dies, their father dies, and suddenly the brothers are thinking, well, now that our father's dead, now Joseph, he's going to have his revenge on us. And so they appeal to him, for mercy. But in chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph, he's reassuring them that I'm not intending on revenge. I've forgiven you. He says, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is to this day, to save much people alive. So he says, God, his intention was for me to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, so that I could save lives by gathering all this grain, so there would be food during the 7 years of famine, and all the individual events that happened that got me here. That's not your fault. It's not the fault of all the people that put me that like for me to get locked into jail and prison and all the things that happened there. He said God was orchestrating all of it so that I could save lives. And so he's forgiving his brothers for doing this. And as we go through our life, we got to recognize God is guiding all the steps in our life. So when things happen to us that we like, we can thank God for it. But when things happen that we don't like, and we think, Lord, why'd you let this happen? Well, God is still in control. He's allowing these things to happen. I mean, if anybody's life was an illustration of Romans 8:28, Joseph's life is, because Romans 8:28 says, for all things work together for good, to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. Why? Because God can take whatever circumstances and use them for His glory and to accomplish His ends. So when things go south in your life, just trust God that He's still in control, and He is still He may actually have caused that event to happen so that He can bring His will to pass to get you. Because there was so many different opportunities that Joseph's life could have went in a totally different direction, but God was guiding his steps to put him there in Egypt, in control of Egypt, so that he could do what God had called him to do. And he can do the same thing in our lives. All right. So I guess, I am out of time. So I guess until next week, study these scriptures.